it just makes America look slightly crazy at the moment, and that if China is the main geopolitical rival to world leadership, that's good for China.
Richard Spencer, thank you so much for speaking to us. How does this legal back and forth around tariffs and Trump's power to put tariffs on or not put tariffs on affect China?
It affects China in numerous ways. I mean, it affects China badly because obviously China has a huge export market, a particularly strong export market with America. That's what this is all about. In terms of America's trade deficit, which is what Trump says he's focused on. Obviously, the most significant part of that is with China. It's particularly emotionally significant because so much of it is in manufacturing, where America feels that it has lost out, and it's lost out to what is now its greatest rival. So the tariffs are having a big effect in China already. Factories are closing. There's a lot of uncertainty about investment in more factories, particularly those targeting the American market. Um, on the other hand, it's not all bad for China in that it was already trying to swivel away somewhat from the American market. I mean, it's America's share of its exports has gone down from 30% to about 13 or 14% in the last couple of decades. China is aware that a lot of American politicians, a lot of America wants to sort of decouple, to use the famous phrase from China. So it's now being impelled even further to sort of separate its supply chains away from America. And the other way it affects China is it just makes America look slightly crazy at the moment, and that if China is the main geopolitical rival to world leadership, that's good for China. The sight of these very peremptory tariffs being brought in by Trump without any real consultation, anyone knowing what to expect. Then Trump suspends them when the market goes crazy. Then the courts rule against them, and then again last night says he can carry on with the tariffs policy further, until there's another court ruling. This uncertainty makes the Chinese way of doing things, with its 5-year plans and its long-term strategies and its very clear signalling of how it wants its export policy to work, makes it look rather attractive. I mean, for as long as I was, growing up and starting to report, the assumption was that this Soviet throwback of 5-year plans and 10-year plans was just an economic disaster waiting to happen. And the more quick thinking of way of approaching things of American entrepreneurship was the great way forward. Now we've got a China that can seemingly kind of allow its businesses to think on their feet while the government takes a long-term strategic approach. And for a lot of people, particularly in third countries, particularly in the global south, that's not looking too unattractive at the moment.
It's a big if, but let's say at the end of the legal processes in America, the courts decide Trump does not have the power to levy and then lift tariffs in the way that he has been. What other ways then will he try to keep pressuring China if it is not through tariffs and that sort of economic warfare, I suppose?
Well, there is, of course, I mean, the cynic and the cheap shot, if I were in American politics, would say, well, you could do what, Joe Biden did. Joe Biden also had a tariffs policy on China. He also had a policy of trying to encourage particularly high tech firms, particularly firms making things like high end computer chips, uh, separate themselves from Chinese supply chains, establish themselves in friendly countries, not unfriendly countries. He had massive tariffs on some of the new tech products that China is starting to dominate the market in. Solar panels already dominates the market in. That is now felt by a lot of countries to be a mistake. China has sort of 80 to 90% of the global solar panels market, which is obviously key to all our green energy net zero targets. It was starting to look that they were going to go the same way on electric vehicles. China's electric vehicle manufacturers, its car companies, are massive. The biggest one is now bigger than Tesla on a global sales basis. So Biden moved against that and put massive 100% tariffs on Chinese electric cars. But he did it in a somewhat more normal way. He went through the usual processes of consultation, and he didn't kind of challenge the Congress and the courts. He didn't sort of stand up there on a liberation day and say, right, we're going to screw over the rest of the world. Yabu sucks. So there is that possibility. There is that boring, old-fashioned way of doing politics, which most countries do, and America did until Donald Trump came in. Um, I think if there is to look at it on the other side, to look at it from the point of view of the Trump splainers, these pro-Trump people who come from a slightly more normal background, who say, this is all part of a strategy. This is not just as chaotic as it looks. Um, America really had to be woken up to the challenge that China posed. It really had to wake up to the economic imbalances caused by globalization, what they would say is a one-sided globalization, and a lot of economists would agree that the world economy has become skewed in favor of these giant low-cost manufacturing economies, and that is not good for the debt markets, for fiscal policy, for the left behind places, whether in Britain or America, that have lost their manufacturing industry. Particularly when in other areas like free movement of capital, for example, free movement of service industries, they are not subject to the same global rules as manufacturing it is in terms of the World Trade Organization. So there is an argument that this is the shock therapy, and that at the end of all this, once the world is saying, Jesus, now America's taking this issue seriously, we've got to take this seriously, America has to take it seriously, China has to take it seriously, uh, other manufacturing countries like Vietnam, India, Mexico have to start, looking a bit more globally in terms of how this trade balances work out on a global level. And then you can get the Congress involved. You can get trade negotiators involved. You can get even maybe probably not the World Trade Organization, which has had a bit of a rough time of it over all this and has lost a bit of credibility. But you could see that being revived in some form. You could see the rules of global trade being changed by a sort of consultative process, which might be to everyone's long-term advantage. Particularly remove some of the sort of crazier economic balances that the economists and some of the financial markets fear, like the huge American debt pile, for example.
I suppose that's the question: is can the US-China relationship go back to what it was before, I don't know, January the 20th, 2025, or is this a turning point in China's relationship with the United States, their sort of interlocked economies, and I suppose their strategic relationship going forward?
Well, I'd say if you've been, I would say, I would chat. I mean, although that's the question everyone's asking, I would actually challenge the terms of that question. The China America relationship is incredibly dynamic. It has been essentially, I mean, if you really want to be historical, it has been ever since the communists took over with China. America isolated China, China isolated itself with this extraordinarily weird experiment in agrarian communism, or whatever you call what Chairman Mao did. And then, America brought China in from the cold in the 1970s with the outreach by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger to Chairman Mao in the early 70s that ultimately led to a new arrangement between China and the rest of the world. China got its seat at the United Nations, got its seat on the People's Republic of China. The communists got their seat on the their permanent seat on the Security Council. They opened up their economy. You then had these extraordinary shifts in trading patterns. First with cheap Chinese toys being made, but very quickly, and particularly when it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, becoming this manufacturing superpower. It was done with huge amounts of disruption on all sides. Without wishing to talk too historically, but just to talk about how China sees this, as how big it has been for Chinese people. In between 1996 and 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, it had to reform all its industry, which was majority state-owned with an old-fashioned Soviet system that had been reformed and was being reformed in the private sector sort of low down, people setting up their own shops outside the commune system, people setting up their own small manufacturing businesses, money from Hong Kong coming into the south over the border into low-cost factories. But between 96 and 2001, to reform the big industries, the coal, the steel, the big manufacturing, the power companies, the core infrastructure, when those were semi-privatized, China laid off 50 million workers. 50 million workers. That is an extraordinary thing to do. And I say that to show how dynamic this relationship was. And then within a few years, by the mid 2000s, 30% of China's exports were going to America. China was accumulating American dollar foreign exchange reserves, lending money, if you like, to the American government by the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. I mean, an incredible shift in policy. And that has been continuing to change because, as I say, as it's become a technological as well as a manufacturing superpower, not just Trump, but other American politicians have said, well, hang on, we've got to, this has to be in some way controlled, looked at, monitored. We can't just let China, take all our technology and turn it into tech firms that will destroy our tech firms, and military prowess that will outrank our military prowess, given that they've got a billion people to do it with, which only India and other countries have. So this has been changing. It changed under the first Trump term. Biden, as I say, introduced this idea of decoupling, a conscious decoupling, to use the Gwyneth Paltrow term, if you like, whereby the relationship would change slowly, but in an organized way. There was a big fallout. There's a much bigger fallout between Biden and Xi Jinping than there has been between Trump and Xi Jinping. I mean, this has now been forgotten because we have such short attention spans. But Xi Jinping refused to allow any officials to speak to Americans for 18 months between 22 and 23 because he was so angry with what America was doing. So this did not start on January the 20th or on April the 2nd when Trump announced Liberation Day. He just turned it into a sort of Trump show, as he does. But these are very long. These are not long. These are medium to long term patterns that are being played out here, and the danger of what Trump has done is that actually he's done it in such a chaotic way that it's actually helped China. He would say that he was just giving it a massive fillip by really waking people up who weren't focusing on what America was trying to do.
Gwyneth Paltrow and tariffs. I never quite thought I'd see the day. You've written that the question now is whether the Communist Party can continue to thrive if the economic relationship is permanently changed. Can it? And is there an argument to say that trying to undermine the Communist Party and its ability to thrive was the point of the tariffs in the first place?
Yeah, so that's a very good question because there was undoubtedly an element of that among some of Trump's advisors. Some of Trump's advisors are furiously anti-China, particularly his trade counselor Peter Navarro, who's written books about the dangers of China, and there is always this undercurrent of regime change think. Excuse me. There's always this element of regime change think in America, particularly since 1989, of course. And there's always this idea. It wouldn't it be nice if China wasn't, run by the Communist parties, and wouldn't it be nice if Iran wasn't run by the Islamic theocracy. I don't think that's the strategy. I don't think the strategy is saying right, A leads to B leads to C. It's saying there are various outcomes. We've got to sort of maximize the American advantage of these outcomes, um, and that means weakening China. Now, if China says, well, actually, as an entity, actually, the way we've been doing things is unsustainable. I mean, there is an argument, and there's a strong argument made by lots of people who look at China that the way it governs itself um, uh, is unsustainable because it relies on this sort of slightly weird mixture of strong state control and strong business reliance on trade with capitalist countries. That if, to put it in a macro way, if America didn't allow free movement of capital, to allow all its investment funds and all its dollar foreign exchanges of reserves, the dollar to be traded around the world as the hegemonic currency of trade. If China wasn't able to slot into this American dominated, Western dominated trading system, China wouldn't be where it was, and ultimately, it can't have it both ways, both from a trade point of view and from a kind of freedom of thought point of view. Can you send? Is it sustainable for China, let alone the world? But is it sustainable for China to send hundreds of thousands of students every year, 300,000 students, 200 to 300,000 students a year going to America, another, I think, 100,000 coming to Britain, more going to other Western countries to learn science, and then have them go back to China to, invest their astonishing learning and scientific abilities that they have after a Chinese education, followed by PhDs in optical engineering at top American and British universities and so on. Is it sustainable that they could all go back and say, right, okay, we've had our 3 years where we could talk about politics and see how freedom of thought works, and then just become loyal subjects of the party bosses in the research institutions and the companies that we then go and work for. Now, I mean, the answer so far is yes. It is perfectly possible to do that if you pay them well enough, and the game goes on. I mean, there are still lots of poor people in China to be brought out of poverty. There is still a lot of virtue and economic growth in China. There's still a lot of factories that can be built. There's still hospitals and welfare states to be built in China, which the Communist Party says it's going to do, and it says to everyone, if you buckle down, work hard, do what we tell you to, don't go and have protests or demand elections, you will get all these nice things. It doesn't look like the way we would do things, but then China's a big country that's been going a long time, and can probably keep this cycle going for another few years or decades and see what happens. I mean, the downside is that when Chinese regimes fall, dynasties, as we used to call them, the Ming dynasty or the Qing dynasty, and a lot of people say the Communist Party is essentially now a type of royal dynasty. When they fall in a very bloody and messy way. So some Chinese people I know who are thoughtful about these things say, well, actually, the important thing is to allow a sort of dynamic process of change. I mean, the Communist Party isn't going to sort of announce tomorrow free elections and, Xi Jinping float off into retirement somewhere. But there are those people who say that China has to change dynamically. So the question really in the short term, a more specific answer to your question is, there will be, if these tariffs go through, if the trade chaos around the world continues on the back of what Trump's doing, there will be lots of people unemployed in China. It's having a bit of a economic hard time. It's being forced to invest more debt. It's a very indebted country now. It's not quite as indebted as America is, but then it's not as wealthy a country as America still, for most people. So it's an indebted country. It's got to sort of keep the government spending going to keep people happy. in the face of probably, there could be more millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of job losses as a result of all this, possibly millions. You don't want to see lots of unemployed people on the streets. There's the recent graduates of the last couple of years coming out of the big universities in across China, the massively expanded university sector. They're all pretty miserable. They're not getting good jobs. There are a lot of students, a lot of graduates are becoming sort of delivery drivers and the China, working in the Chinese equivalent of Uber and Deliveroo and so on. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction around, but on the street you don't feel that there's a sort of, there's grumbling, but you don't feel that there's an inflection moment coming.
Richard Spencer, thank you very much.
That's a pleasure.